The viewpoints expressed on Night Fright are not necessarily those of the host, the staff, the sponsors, or the affiliate stations. Tonight's program may contain graphic themes or images. Viewer discretion is advised.
There is a time for question. There is a time for answers. There is a time to challenge. There is a time to speculate. There is a time for change. There is a time for truth. The time is now. Welcome to Night Fright, your voice in the dark for harmony and conspiracy. And now your host, Brent Holland.
Showtime! Welcome to the show, everybody. Welcome to Night Fright. Get in your most comfy chair, get the coffee going, get the tea going, or a beverage of choice. Have we got a great ride for you tonight? The film is called A Coup in Camelot. It's an award-winning documentary that details the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Now, it's available to be got at iTunes, Amazon Video Direct, Google Play, and Vimeo On Demand. 5 decades ago, it's 5 decades already, folks, November 22nd, 1963. President Kennedy's assassination, of course. Crucial questions remain. The documentary A Coup in Camelot provides extensive evidence of botched Secret Service protocols, Zapruder film analysis with 6K digital scans. It's immaculate. Shocking medical evidence revelations and expert Oswald analysis, all to uncover the dramatic tale of the JFK assassination and what we were told by the government then and what we now know today. The researchers featured in the documentary are author Sherry Feaster, forensics expert using crime scene techniques that were not available in 1963. She has found a frontal shot. She has used science to find and prove a frontal shot, and we know what that means. It means that the Warren Commission's lone nut assassin shooting from behind President Kennedy has now been exploded. That myth is over. Science now proves 2 shooters, by definition, a conspiracy. That's right, that's what you're going to find in A Coup in Camelot. Barry Ernest, also an Oswald expert. Dr. David Mantic, radiologist. Doug Horn, Assassination Records Review Board expert. Both those folks were on several weeks ago. You're going to find that show in the www.nightfrightshow.com archives. And absolutely explosive stuff they both brought to the show. You're going to want to check that out for sure. Author Vince Palomara, Secret Service expert. Jerry Dealey, Dealey Plaza specialist. Also, both of those folks were on last week. Check that show out, www.nightfrightshow as well. You're going to find out all the things the Secret Service were supposed to do and yet neglected not to. Also, you're going to find a lot out about Dealey Plaza from Jerry Dealey. Yeah, the name is the same. And the Texas School Book Depository. And was it possible for Oswald to make it down all those sets of stairs in the time allotted? Listen to the show, folks. Get the documentary, A Coup in Camelot. Also, our special guest this evening, I'm very happy and proud to have Dick Russell on the show tonight. He's an Oswald expert, and his book, The Man Who Knew Too Much, well, it's simply a legend in the community, isn't it, that book? It's kind of on par with David Lifton's Best Evidence for the amount of people that have read it. Little bit of bio before we get going with Dick. Dick Russell is the author of 12 books, including 3 on the assassination of President Kennedy and several bestsellers with Jesse Ventura. You can find Jesse's show in the archives, www.nightfrightshow.com. And by the way, Dick, Jesse spoke glowingly of you.
Absolutely glowingly. But he wants his
he wants the thing he lent you, he told me to tell you back, whatever that is. I don't know if it's a lawnmower or the $1 million or whatever it is. His groundbreaking book, The Man Who Knew Too Much, is considered a classic, as I said before, in the JFK assassination literature. Dick Russell is also the winner of the Chevron Conservation Award. Welcome to the show, Dick. Thanks for coming back after all these years. 2008 was the last time you were on, by the way.
Was it really? Well, time's really flying. Thank you, Brent. Good to be with you.
It's unbelievable. Okay, let's talk a little bit about your role in A Coup in Camelot. How did this come about for you?
You know, it was the 50th anniversary year, 2013, and actually A Coup in Camelot was one of several shows that I was on that year talking about what really happened on November 22nd, 1963, as far as I've been able to piece it together as a journalist. And so they interviewed me, Art Van Kampen and his crew, one day, and they wanted to know a lot of things about Oswald, whom I'd studied pretty intensively for a number of years. Actually, I spent 17 years researching The Man Who Knew Too Much, not full time, but off and on. And so it was an obsession, a labor of love. I finally put the book out in 1992, and I was pleased to be part of Coup in Camelot. I think it's a really outstanding documentary.
Now, your role in it, you talk about Oswald quite a bit. I was wondering if we can go in that direction first, and most definitely I would like to get to Richard Case Nagell, if that's okay with you. But
Sure.
Let's start out with A Coup in Camelot. You talk about Oswald, as I said, quite a bit. What are the revelations that you bring?
My research shows that he is really as much of an enigma in many ways today as he was then. Certainly someone who had intelligence connections to the CIA, to the FBI, perhaps to the Cuban intelligence people as well, and had lived, for 2.5 years in the Soviet Union after he supposedly defected from the Marine Corps from Atsugi Naval Air Base in Japan. Actually, he didn't go right from there, but he came back to the U.S. first. But spent 2.5 years in the Soviet Union, and then certainly had connections with Cubans. Went to the Cuban embassy, either he or someone impersonating him, in Mexico City in September of '63. And Oswald was used by a lot of people. Also, he was young. What his real ideology was is difficult to say to this day. He came across as a Trotskyite leftist, but as I say, he had strong connections to the CIA, to the FBI. We can get into more of that. And I think he was, beyond a doubt, the patsy on November 22nd, 1963, that he was set up by a small cabal of people, maybe not so small, I don't know, to take the fall for President Kennedy's assassination. And then, of course, he had to be silenced a couple of days later by Jack Ruby. So, he's a mysterious figure, and we can talk quite a bit more about him and his connections with other people that I researched, if you'd like.
Yeah, absolutely. And you brought up Jack Ruby, and that was where I wanted to go next, actually. And I just want to read this quote by Jack Ruby. Now, folks, Jack Ruby, for the younger folk that do not know, Jack Ruby was the assassin of Lee Harvey Oswald. Now, what's the first rule in assassination? Kill the assassin. 3 days after JFK was killed, on November 24th, JFK was killed on the 22nd, Oswald was being ushered out of a supposedly secured police station with 70 police officers around him. There was press there. He was going to be taken to a more secure facility. Everybody thought he was safe until Jack Ruby stepped forward and put a single bullet into Lee Harvey Oswald, killing him, not on the spot, but later on. He died and succumbed from his wounds. So we don't know what Oswald knew. He never said anything. Jack Ruby, of course, was taken to jail, and this is one of the quotes that Jack Ruby said when he was being interviewed. "The world will never know the true facts of what occurred. My own true motive. I'm the only person in the background that knows the truth. The people that put me in this position will never let the true facts come above board to the world." Jack Ruby. What's your take on that, Dick?
Oh, I think Jack Ruby, I believe, in that same conversation with the Warren Commission, asked to be taken to Washington, where he said he would be able to reveal more than he could there in Dallas. Ruby, he was a Dallas nightclub owner. He was very well connected to the local police, to the media in town, and to the mafia. He was close to the head of the Dallas mafia, and had certainly had connections with and phone calls with, and we now know, Carlos Marcello. I think that Ruby was not part of the original conspiracy necessarily, but was brought in by the powers that killed President Kennedy in order to make sure that Oswald never did talk about his connection. So whether Ruby owed somebody big time, why he did this exactly, we'll probably never know. He was perhaps dying at the time of cancer. He died of cancer when he was in jail. And I think that Ruby was sent in by the mob, but that the mob per se did not assassinate President Kennedy.
What then was the mob's role? Because we've got Jim Braden, as I mentioned last week when Jerry Dealey was here with Vince. I mentioned last week the story about Jim Braden. Very quickly, folks, he was a known mafioso. He was arrested and questioned seconds after the assassination took place, was released. He had mafioso connections. He was arrested just outside the Daltex building, where he was lurking inside that particular building. That particular building was right beside the Texas School Book Depository building, where many people felt the shots had emanated from. What is, in your opinion, the role of the mob in all of this? Are they just the money people, the bag people, or was there more to it than that?
Well, certainly we now know, and didn't at the time, but not until the mid-1970s, that the mob was very involved with the CIA in plots to assassinate Castro. They had to leave Cuba when their casinos and much else were nationalized when Fidel Castro took power in 1959. They hated Castro. There were a lot of anti-Castro Cuban exiles that they were close to and working with in illicit, drug trafficking and whatever. And so the mob had a history with the CIA, close ties with the CIA, going all the way back actually to World War II and Lucky Luciano. But in this case, the mob, however, a lot of people think that the mob killed Kennedy, and Marcello did it, and you have a lot of people that certainly were knowledgeable about it, Johnny Roselli and Sam Giancana and others who ended up very dead when the investigations were going on in the 1970s. But the mob didn't have the wherewithal to cover up this assassination like it was covered up. I mean, they just didn't have that kind of power. And there was a huge cover-up, as your viewers know, from the fact that the autopsy results were altered, and the Zapruder film shows there was another shooter, and that was altered. But at any rate, I think the mob's role, and this would bring Ruby into it too, was to basically, they certainly were cognizant that Kennedy was going to be killed. They may have hired some of the shooters, or one or two of the shooters, perhaps the connection all the way to the French mafia in Marseille, but they didn't pull the strings. They were the ones that sent Jack Ruby in because they already had connections with him, and perhaps he owed them something, and so he was their guy.
Dick Russell's our guest tonight, folks, and you're going to recognize that name for sure if you're attached to the community at all, or if you've read many books on the assassination. His book, of course, is The Man Who Knew Too Much. It's the story of Richard Case Nagell, which we're going to be getting into in just a few minutes. www.nightfrightshow.com. You can click on his book cover that's going to be there. You can order his book from the books from the comfort of your own home. There will be a bunch there. And also, there'll be a link there that'll take you right to a spot where you can download and get the documentary, A Coup in Camelot. Something else I wanted to talk to you about, Dick, is the memo from Nicholas Katzenbach. And this is an important memo. It was made November 25th, which was the Monday, folks. It was only a few days after the 22nd on the Friday. And it starts off, memorandum for Mr. Moyers, which is Bill Moyers, the same guy that's on PBS, by the way, folks. And he was one of the folks that was very close to Lyndon Johnson, the new president. And there are several bullet points, but the main bullet point I want to read out and want to discuss with Dick is the public must be satisfied that Oswald was the assassin, that he did not have Confederates who are still at large, and that the evidence was such that he would have been convicted at a trial. Now, the important line there is, folks, that he did not have Confederates. In other words, he was a lone nut assassin. Again, Dick, what's your take on this particular memorandum?
Well, I think right from the get-go, people at high levels of this government who were not involved in a conspiracy to assassinate President Kennedy, but definitely wanted to put a lid on this, because my hypothesis is, based on many years of research, is that Oswald, as we know, had ties to the Russians and to the Cubans, that there was an effort being made by the plotters to ensure that Oswald was picked up, was shown to be the killer, and that the finger would point back to Cuba and perhaps even to the Soviet Union. And that would spark an invasion of Cuba, which is what some of the people wanted, the mafia, the CIA, elements of the CIA, the Cuban exile community, and basically get rid of Castro after claiming that he killed President Kennedy. So it was made to look that way, and I think it was made to look that way officially as well, that people, in other words, Earl Warren, for example, who was an honorable man leading the Warren Commission, he's not going to mount a conscious cover-up unless there's a really good reason for it. And I think that a lot of people were told, perhaps Johnson among them, that there was a big conspiracy here, and it involved the Cubans and the Russians, and if the truth came out about this, even though it wasn't the truth, we would be forced into a confrontation, a potential World War III situation, and nobody wanted to risk that. So that's where I think the cover-up emanated from, although I'm sure you had people on the Warren Commission, like Alan Dulles, who had very different reasons for covering up.
I agree with you completely. And let's not forget, folks, we've got to put this into the context of the era. We were just a little over a year from the Cuban Missile Crisis, where we were that close to not being here. And so when somebody tells you we're concerned that the Russians were involved and there's a possibility for another nuclear standoff, or perhaps even worse, it would emanate into World War III, you kind of take national security into account for that. And we know that O'Donnell and Dave Powers both lied about what they saw in the follow-up car in Dealey Plaza that day. They both saw the shots coming from the Grassy Knoll, and they were both asked to squash that down. There's no breach of national security. So it looks like everything was being manipulated around that. Dick, was Johnson involved at all, in your opinion?
I've heard different things on that. Certainly his mistress, Madeline Brown, who I talked to way back in the early 90s, believed that he had foreknowledge. He was in the motorcade. He seemed terrified. That a lot of people think he was, but I have never seen enough to convince me that Johnson himself would have directly participated in what was basically a coup to overthrow President Kennedy.
The people surrounding him, was there anybody in the inner circle you think might have been cognizant of the and held it back from Johnson till it was too late?
It's possible that there were people who might have done that, but I wouldn't want to speculate on who inside the cabinet itself that would have been.
Okay, you had mentioned the anti-Castro Cubans, the exiles, primarily out of Florida. Can we go there now? Can we talk a little bit about the man who knew too much? And can you give an overview of Richard Case Nagell, and then we'll get into it?
Sure.
Here we go again.
He's a very complicated figure as well. He's not somebody I just researched. I knew him. That's a story we can get into, perhaps. I knocked on his door in 1975 when he was living in Manhattan Beach, California, and he, with reluctance, let me in. I'd been led to him by Professor Richard Popkin, who wrote a great book back in the 60s called The Second Oswald. And in 1975, he was basically announcing to the world that whichever journalist would show up, that he had solved the Kennedy assassination. So a number of journalists made their way to his door, including myself. I didn't know that much about the assassination at the time. I was living in New York and writing for the Village Voice, among others, freelancing. The Voice flew me out there to San Diego to meet with Professor Popkin. And he had two alternate scenarios, all of which tended to discredit him in the eyes of most of the media. One was about this sort of Manchurian candidate named Luis Castillo, who had been arrested in the Philippines in '67 for plotting to assassinate President Marcos. And the other was this guy, Richard Case Nagell, who Popkin had talked to him on the phone, had obtained a notebook. Bernard Fensterwald Jr. was representing Nagell at the time in a case that Nagell had filed to try to get a full disability retirement from the Army in the U.S. Court of Claims. And there had been, all right, we should backtrack a little bit now. Who was Nagell? Why is he important? On September 20th, 1963, Richard Nagell walked into a bank in El Paso, Texas, went up to a teller, asked for $100 in American Express traveler's checks, turned away and shot 2 holes in the ceiling of the bank. Walked outside the bank and waited to get himself arrested. This was 2 months and 2 days before the assassination of President Kennedy. So Nagell was taken into FBI custody, and he told the FBI, "Why don't you look in the trunk of my car and get that machine gun out of there?" And there were other things as well. So the FBI, among other paraphernalia, they seized photographs, they seized 2 notebooks. One of these notebooks was held for many years by the federal government and finally returned in a Freedom of Information Act request to Fensterwald in 1975. Popkin had a copy of this notebook. I took it back to New York, where I was living at the time, and I started going through it, and I realized that there were a number of similarities, not just similarities, but startling ones, to Oswald's notebook that had been taken by the FBI after the assassination. These included the phone number, and the address of the Cuban embassy in Mexico City, listings for the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, especially a branch in Los Angeles that Nagell himself had been connected with. So I got very curious about this guy. There was an address that Professor Popkin had for him in Manhattan Beach, and I just went and knocked on his door, and with considerable reluctance at the time, he sort of came to the door and peered out. He decided to let me in. And that was the beginning of an odyssey that occupied me for the next, 17 years, but almost full time for 2.5 years, and in the course of which I came to know Richard Nagell pretty well.
In your opinion, was he authentic?
Oh, yeah. I met a lot of people. I interviewed many so-called witnesses to not the assassination itself, but people who had knowledge of how it had been set up and so on. And most of them, a number of them anyway, I came to either dismiss or believe that, they were fudging it. They were making up some of the details that they told me. You can't know that until you start piecing together different people's stories. But of all of them, all the people that I interviewed, and there were dozens back in those days, and I was the first journalist, I think, to interview many of these people. There were 2 whose credibility really held up for me. One of them was Nagell, and the other was Antonio Vecchiana, who was a Cuban exile in Miami. We can talk about him, too, if you'd like.
Richard Case Nagell. Now, a lot of people aren't aware of this, but JFK, the movie by Oliver Stone, has a composite character. Everybody thinks primarily the character is L. Fletcher Prouty, Colonel Prouty, Man X played by Donald Sutherland. It is not just Prouty, it is also Nagell, because, it's a composite character. What part of the puzzle does he fill in this whole narrative?
Okay, it's a relatively long story, but I'll abbreviate it. Nagell was during the 1950s. He was a soldier in the Korean War. He was the youngest soldier promoted to captain during that conflict. He was wounded several times. He got the Purple Heart. He was a highly decorated young soldier. He then went on into military intelligence in the 1950s and worked closely with a unit called Field Operations Intelligence, FOI, which was a top secret organization. You couldn't even mention its name without being court-martialed. He was very bright. He was, like Oswald, the product of a broken home. He was an orphan kid, grew up in Albany, New York, and so he in Japan in 1957, he first encountered Oswald, had what he called a brief but purposeful acquaintance, was somehow involved in Oswald's defection, or so-called defection, to Russia. So he had met him at that point in time, and in 1962, the fall of 62, Nagell was working for the CIA. He worked for the CIA and for military intelligence. And he also had a reputation as someone who might have worked the other side of the street. In other words, that he may have had connections with the KGB or the GRU, that he'd been very disillusioned, it was said, by things that he'd been asked to do when he was in the service, and had therefore had this leftist bent. So he was an ideal double agent, I guess you would say. And when he went to Mexico City in the fall of 62 during the Cuban Missile Crisis, he was put to work, he was assigned by the CIA to cozy up to or connect with high-ranking officer in Mexico City of Soviet intelligence during this very crucial, terrifying time in our history, the missile crisis. And when he left Mexico City, he was given an assignment, actually two assignments by the Soviets. One was to keep an eye on this young guy who had just come back from Russia, because the Russians wondered about him and they didn't know what kind of connections he had. Was he unstable? Could he do something that would embarrass them? That was one assignment. And the other was to keep an eye on a group called Alpha 66, members of a group called Alpha 66, a Cuban exile organization closely tied to the CIA that was reportedly, according to information the Russians had, planning an assassination attempt against President Kennedy for later that same year. So that was Nagell's double mission. He went back he went to Dallas. He made some inquiries about Oswald. He was involved at the end of that year in being aware of and perhaps a part of, in a sense, so he could report back on it, a plot to kill President Kennedy at the Orange Bowl in Miami, when he addressed the returning Bay of Pigs prisoners during this prisoner exchange. That plot, which was to plant a bomb in the armory near the speaker's podium, did not get past the talking stage. There was another plot in June of '63 in Los Angeles when Kennedy came out to the premiere of the movie PT 109 about his wartime years. That also did not come to fruition, although Nagell was privy to it. And at this point, in the summer of '63, Oswald is brought into this scenario by these, and Nagell perhaps did it himself. I mean, he'd been monitoring Oswald, connecting with him. He was involved in this small conspiracy. He never admitted bringing Oswald into this plot, but I believe it's quite likely that he did. Oswald was duped by these two Cuban exiles who used the code names Angel and Leopoldo. And they supposedly convinced Oswald that they were agents of Castro, and that if he would participate in an assassination attempt, at least against Kennedy, he'd be welcomed in Cuba as a revolutionary hero. Now, whether Oswald really believed this or not, or whether he had his own intelligence connections that he was reporting to, we don't know. But this is what Nagell knew, and Nagell was told by the Russians to either convince Oswald he was being set up or kill him in Mexico City, take him out of the picture. Rather than do that, and Nagell said the reason is because he'd killed before, he didn't want to do it again. He felt that he could warn the proper authorities in the U.S. that he was already in touch with, and they would stop this situation. So he sent a warning letter on September 17th, 1963 to J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI, giving him enough information to warrant the arrest of Oswald and these two Cuban exiles, because they were really anti-Castro Cubans who had been working for the CIA for some time. And also he contacted his people at the CIA as high as Desmond Fitzgerald, and his case officer, who I now know was a man named Henry Heckscher, and basically told them what was happening, and then took himself out of the picture, Nagell did, by walking into this bank in El Paso and intentionally getting himself placed in custody.
Why was he so nervous? Why did he want to take himself out of the whole scenario? Was he afraid he was going to be assassinated himself?
I think that may have been part of it. I think he was certainly afraid he was going to be implicated, and he was trying to scuttle this whole situation. It was originally planned not for Dallas, but for Washington, D.C. area at the end of September '63. So it was coming right up, and he made his decision and believed that he would not be held in jail for as long as he was. He ended up being railroaded for 4.5 years. One of the reasons that I came to believe that Nagell was extremely credible was I had corroborating evidence. There was the arresting officer was a young guy named Jim Bundren, who was named Rookie of the Year in El Paso for his brave act in basically arresting Nagell as he stood on the stairs outside the bank, or on the street. But Bundren was a good man, and I interviewed him twice, and the second time he told me that he was sitting next to Nagell at a preliminary hearing. Nagell was charged with attempted bank robbery. It was all over the El Paso papers. It was a big deal. And on November 4th, which is 3 weeks before the assassination, he's sitting next to Nagell, and he looked at Nagell and he said, you didn't really try to rob that bank, did you? Nagell said, no, you're a pretty smart cop, aren't you? I said, no, I didn't. He said, but I'll tell you this much, I wouldn't want to be in Dallas right now. Bundren never forgot that, you can imagine. He knew that Nagell knew that something terrible was going to happen in Dallas, and of course when it did, Bundren was himself pretty shaken up. and didn't talk about it for a long time.
Did he think Oswald was being set up as a patsy?
Did who think? Bundren?
Nagell.
Oh yeah.
For sure. And he saw that and he mirrored it to himself as well, I suspect.
And he tried to get the word out about it during his preliminary trial. I mean, he brought up, and it was in the El Paso papers, that the FBI is covering this whole thing up, that they were told what was going to go down. And by this point, interestingly, you asked about Lyndon Johnson before, there was a new judge in Nagell's case. The first judge was gone, and the judge who suddenly came in January of 1964, before Nagell's first trial, was Homer Thornberry, who was a very close friend of Lyndon Johnson's, was in fact in the motorcade that day in Dallas. And he suddenly, he's a Texas judge. He enters this case and basically does everything he can. You can read this in the court transcripts to shut down Nagell being able to say anything that he wanted to say about anything besides a so-called attempted bank robbery.
Wow, I was unaware of that. That's very, very explosive.
Yeah. Yes, it is.
Absolutely. Now, did Nagell have any proof or any photographs or anything of that nature?
He did. He did. I didn't see this photograph. He told me of a photograph that had been taken by a street vendor in Jackson Square Park in New Orleans in September of '63, which it was a Polaroid picture. He had secreted it away in Switzerland in a bank vault, and untimely demise that he'd arranged for this and a number of other things to be released to the public. One thing that I did see, and that is in the photo section of The Man Who Knew Too Much, is a Uniformed Services identification card for Oswald, which is identical to a card that appeared in the Warren Commission that was discovered, I think, published first by Judy Bonner in her book way back about Sheriff Curry. But anyway, it had only appeared one time anywhere. It was the same card, but it had a different face and a different signature. And it had the overstamp was on it. So it was a legitimate card that somehow Nagell had obtained, probably from Oswald himself, and kept among his effects. So this to me was, besides the notebook and what Bundren said, and others that I managed to speak with about him, very strong evidence that Nagell was, as far as he was willing to go, not making up a story. And I should add that he was never willing to tell me or anybody else the whole story of what he knew.
The other thing I wanted to ask you, when he was incarcerated, I think it was in Spring Hill, is that correct?
Springfield.
Okay, I apologize. It's the same prison that Abraham Bolden was incarcerated in. Now, rumor has it that they were in adjoining cells, or...
That's true.
Oh,
yes,
my God. What are the chances of that?
Well, I think the authorities were very interested in, or I'm talking authorities meaning CIA, FBI, whoever, in finding out what Bolden and Nagell might share with each other. So they intentionally put Bolden in the cell next to him. Bolden remembers this, and to see what they would say. Now, they did the same thing with a guy named Robert Clayton Buick, who had apparently seen Nagell in Mexico at the Hotel Luma. He'd gone on a bank spree. They picked him up. They put him in jail next to Nagell as well. So there was an effort to, try to see what this guy was going to talk about. Were they going to have to kill him, whatever. And then Garrison sent one of his investigators in 1967 to interview Nagell in Leavenworth, I believe it was. This was a man named William R. Martin, and Nagell told him about a tape recording that had been made of the plotters talking, including Oswald himself and these two Cubans and one other person who he called Raul. Raul was a cover name, a known cover name for this man Henry Heckscher, whom I've only found out about in recent years, who worked closely with David Phillips with the CIA. That's a whole other story, but at any rate, Garrison sent this man in to talk to Nagell, Nagell told him where he could find this tape, who had it. And for whatever reason, that tape never surfaced. And it turned out that William R. Martin was one of a number of people who had worked for the CIA and had penetrated Garrison's staff.
Son of a gun, these revelations are incredible, Dick. Now, you mentioned Raul, and right away I thought to James Earl Ray.
Yes.
Same guy?
No, in fact, a different spelling. This was R-A-U-L, which is the Latin spelling, and I think James Earl Ray's alias was R-A-O-U-L, if I recall.
Okay. Is there any evidence that Abraham Bolden and Richard Case Nagell actually spoke when they were in Springfield?
I don't recall exactly. I think if they did, they probably did. If they were in the adjoining cells, it would have been innocuous. In other words, I don't know if Nagell knew who he was or vice versa. And I asked Bolden about it once, and he seemed a little vague on it. So that's about all I remember. All I know.
The JFK Assassination, the definitive book by Brent Holland. From inside the Oval Office to Dealey Plaza, first-person witness accounts. Order yours right now. nightfrightshow.com.
I should also tell folks, Abraham Bolden, first African-American Secret Service agent handpicked by JFK for White House detail. He was framed for a crime he did not commit. He was incarcerated in Springfield. That's the Reader's Digest. You can find his show also in the www.nightfrightshow.com website. Buy his book, An Echo from Dealey Plaza. This is a fellow that was set up because he was a whistleblower on Secret Service ineptness after the assassination. He was set up for a crime he did not commit. He's still trying to get his name clear after all these years. It is a true tragedy that this has happened to this man. This was a guy who was willing to give his life in a heartbeat for the President of the United States. And I'd go as far as saying that if he had been on duty that day, and he wasn't, we wouldn't be having these discussions right now. I think the President would have lived, without a question. Okay. I touched on Raoul, James Earl Ray, which leads me to MK Ultra. You're going to laugh at this. This is how I'm going to get to it. It's going to be a tough one. Montreal and MK Ultra, the Allen Memorial Hospital. I come from Montreal, folks. No, I'm not under mind control, although I do have an ex-wife, so maybe I am.
Maybe you are.
Okay, can we talk a little bit about MK Ultra and the Allen Memorial?
A big subject again. The guy who was in charge, MK Ultra was a CIA program dating back to the early 1950s that used hypnosis and drugs. They were doing all kinds of testing on unwitting subjects, I should say, to try to see if these could be used in an intelligence capacity to make somebody do something against their will. It was a huge program. Most of the files were destroyed by Richard Helms when he was director of the CIA. So we don't know how far this went, or whether someone like Oswald might have been a part of it. I suspect he could have been when he was young. Allen Memorial Hospital was run by Dr. Ewan Cameron, who was one of the leading contract people that would conduct really unspeakable experiments on people inside that hospital. You know, everything, sleep deprivation, keeping you up for hours, hypnosis, electrodes implanted in you. I mean, it's ghastly what he was doing, but he was doing this with the full approval of the high-ups in the CIA, including, you know, all the way to Alan Dulles and Sidney Gottlieb, who ran the program and who I interviewed before he died in the 1990s. And Gottlieb was actually quite a fascinating figure. He toward the end of his life, he became a Buddhist, and he had a biodynamic garden, I think, that or organic garden at any rate, and sort of a repentant soul in many ways, but was still, I think, not being forthcoming about a lot of things that he'd been involved in.
Can we talk about Hartogs as well? I want to tie it into. You know where I want to go with this now. Yeah,
Renatus Hartogs was he was the guy that the Warren Commission used because he'd interviewed Oswald and spent time with Oswald when Oswald was 13 and was in the youth house in New York, a truant. And Hartogs was used to portray Oswald as a psychopath from a very young age, somebody who would be capable, in Hartogs' view, of doing something like assassinating the president. Well, Hartogs, it turns out, was a part of MK Ultra. He was an expert in hypnosis. He wrote a book on it that he then pretended he never wrote. It was listed in a resume, and then he said, no, I never. I talked to Hartogs once on the phone, very briefly. He's gone now, but he certainly was somebody I would be very suspicious of in terms of his earlier involvement with Oswald and also what he later told the Warren Commission.
Yeah, he pretty much told the Warren Commission that Oswald was a malcontent at a young age. Now, the connection to Montreal there, folks, is Hartog's actually got his psychiatry degree, if I'm not mistaken, from McGill University,
right,
which is attached to the Allen Memorial Hospital. The Allen Memorial is a psychiatric hospital to this day. It looks like hell house, I call it. It really is a creepy looking place, and it's got a really bad vibe to it. But it's a teaching hospital nonetheless. And so this is where the connection comes. Now, the other connection I mentioned, James Earl Ray, who is the purported assassin of Dr. King. He was spotted also in Montreal, not far from that location, actually, where he said he met a fellow by the name of Raoul, and this is where that name came from. And if we go to another report in August of 1963, none other than Lee Harvey Oswald himself was purportedly spotted by a Canadian customs officer, and these are trained guys, giving away pamphlets just around the corner, and I'm not kidding, folks, you're going to be looking at the map right now, from where James Earl Ray first met with Raoul. So Montreal's got this weird connection to all three assassinations, if you will. Maybe perhaps the reason for that is because it is also the Canadian Center for Organized Crime. All the drugs and everything come in because that's a major port right there. And then they get siphoned down to New York, and then from there out to the rest of of America. So very interesting background on that. Okay. Dick, do you want to talk about environmental issues a little bit?
Sure. I have a new book coming out, which Robert Kennedy Jr. has done some editing on and wrote the foreword for, and it's called Horsemen of the Apocalypse, and it's going to be coming out in the spring, and it profiles who these horsemen are. I mean, we're talking about people who actually are now going to be put in charge of some of the key agencies in our country. One of them is Rex Tillerson, who was the CEO of ExxonMobil for many years and has been named Secretary of State by Donald Trump. Tillerson is probably the main guy that I profile in the book, along with his predecessor, Lee Raymond, in a long chapter about Exxon's cover-up of what they knew about the changing climate, going way back through their own scientists.
Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, you know, it came out last year through an investigation by Inside Climate News, an online journal, and in conjunction with Columbia University. And then they went to the Exxon archive and have evidence that they knew back since the late 1980s that global warming, climate change was a very real thing, that it was going to change the dynamic of our weather, and they buried it. In fact, they started funding climate deniers instead, you know, people who would say, oh, we have nothing to worry about. So today we face a situation where, of course, we have a climate denier in the White House now, which is really quite scary. And another one, Scott Pruitt, who's the Attorney General of Oklahoma, who's kind of a minion of Harold Hamm, another horseman I profile in this book. Harold Hamm was a fracker extraordinaire whose fracking is responsible for a lot of these earthquakes that we've been hearing about in Oklahoma, which has finally been admitted by the state. But Scott Pruitt was the Attorney General of Oklahoma, and he has just been named to head the EPA, an agency that basically he thinks should be destroyed. He wants to gut it, its ability to do things like the Clean Power Plan that Obama put forward, which regulates emissions from oil and gas and from power plants, basically. And it will do something to alleviate the situation that we're all facing. I mean, we are in an apocalyptic time as far as the results of global warming, climate change are going to bring to all of us. It's going to be a whole lot worse than we're seeing right now with the increased the sea level rise we see now, the increasing velocity of tornadoes and hurricanes, so the effect of the ocean, the acidification of the ocean, and the coral reefs dying. I mean, it's staggering what's going on our planet and in our country, and yet, you know, we have these climate deniers who are basically going to be running the show. It's going to require some real mobilization on the part of the American people to get out there and make themselves heard that, hey, you know, we got to do something about this, and we got to move to alternative sources of energy, and we got to do it very fast.
Why does Mr. Trump insist on saying that it's China? It's all propaganda.
Who can read Mr. Trump's mind? China is, of course, along with the United States, the leading emitter of greenhouse gases on the planet. China's huge, much bigger than we are. They took this dubious lead a few years ago in what they're putting out. But China also is moved toward alternative sources of energy in a pretty big way, solar and wind and other renewables, because for one thing, of the pollution problem that they have. I mean, you can't. I've never been there, but you can't walk through the streets of Beijing without a face mask on a lot of the time. So for their own reasons, perhaps, but they've gotten more into the fact that the climate is changing and they got to do something about it. I mean, it's often said that unless China and India come on board with curtailing their emissions, then whatever the U.S. does isn't going to mean a damn, because China and India are so much bigger than we are, and there's truth to that. But the fact is, we can't sit back and do nothing, and China and India are making steps, and we could also lead by example and help with the money that we put into a place like India and the poverty in India, to lead them toward different kinds of energy sources than they currently have. So, historically, America has been a leader that people have looked to for these kinds of things, and now we're looked to as an imperial power, and which intervenes and invades in places like Iraq when there's no need to, when it's based on a lie, weapons of mass destruction. So we're facing a real crisis of soul in this country, and time will tell whether we can get through it. But it's going to take people really waking up and seeing that we are facing crises on multiple fronts, and the environment is really the biggest we've got, unless somebody just pushes the button and blows everything up.
I don't know, the turmoil, the assassination in Turkey just happened, and the terrorism across the world is just unbelievable. I'd like to be more optimistic than I really feel. How did we go from JFK to Donald Trump? That's what I want to know from an American. I'm in Canada. We've got young Trudeau here, who is a very idealist.
Yeah.
If I had to pick a word, very much so.
Well, I honestly believe, and the reason I've been so obsessed with getting the truth out about the Kennedy assassination, is that the country has never been the same since that day, that there really was a coup d'etat in America, an unprecedented thing that happened. And then you still had other major leaders of that time, like Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and Robert Kennedy, all of whom were gunned down by, I'm not saying the same people, but by certainly the same forces that did not want to see a change to the status quo in this country. And we had the Vietnam War raging. It all began then. What I see as the decline of the country that I was born in, that I cherish and love, and we've never really recovered, and it's been more than 50 years, and it's been, a downhill slide ever since. I mean, through the Watergate scandal that ended up, toppling Richard Nixon, to all the different, to Reagan coming in, and the Iran-Contra scandal, and all the, the things that Reagan did that continued to lead us down this path. And you have George W. Bush and 9/11, and what was that really all about? A lot of questions remain about that I've looked at in one of my books with Jesse Ventura, American Conspiracies. And thank you. And now we've got Donald Trump. We also have a terrified country, a terrified populace, really, that it doesn't really know what's happening anymore. Yes, the jobs have gone overseas because we have a multinational global, world. And but do you think Donald Trump's going to bring those jobs back? That ain't going to happen. And I'm afraid that there's going to be a lot of disillusioned people before too long who are going to realize little by little that they've been fed a lie.
We headed for another revolution?
I would hope there would be a revolution of sorts, a revolution really of the heart. I don't know that an armed revolution, it might happen. I mean, for one thing, they got the guns. I mean, the people who believe in that climate change is real, or that there was a coup to assassinate President Kennedy, are outnumbered, and we're not going to get out there and take up weapons and try to fight this in that way. But we can certainly fight it with our voices, fight it as in the press. We don't have as free a press as we used to. It's pretty much controlled by a lot of the big media. But at the same time, there's new outlets. through the internet that didn't exist before. You have to sort out what's real and what isn't. But there could, and I have sensed since the election a real coming together that wasn't there before. I think, I certainly wanted Hillary Clinton to win, but I think she represented pretty much status quo, and things would not, might just go on to decay as they have been. I mean, she would do what she could, but this is going to cause real upheaval, and this is going to put people in the boat where, you got to decide, am I going to defend, my immigrant neighbor who's suddenly going to be deported for all the wrong reasons? Am I going to help that person? Are there going to be sanctuary cities? And there are certainly in California now,
Canada. Come to Canada.
A lot of people are going to do that, I think. So,
have you talked to Jesse about this? Because I know Jesse was very pro-Trump. As a matter of fact, he said that if Trump asked him, he would run for vice president.
I think it's I have not talked to him about it lately, but I think it's a misconception to say that he was pro-Trump. I think he saw Trump. Ventura is anti the two political parties because he feels that they have really, destroyed the fabric of this country. It's all about money and who pays who, and he's right. But I don't think so. He felt that Trump being the nominee, and then I haven't talked to him since the election, but would destroy the Republican Party, and Ventura really wanted to see that. He'd like to see the Democratic Party destroyed too, and he'd like to see an independent, form of candidacy emerge that isn't just tied to all these big money interests. So, Ventura's not a Trump guy per se, and they know each other. I know that, and but on certain issues, I know Ventura is very passionately, in favor of civil rights and gay rights and all of these things, which he would never in a million years agree with Trump on.
No, I agree, and he reiterated that on the show as well. The Electoral College. Now, I get what that's about. I understand that completely. It's a good idea to spread out the power among the people right across the country, so it's not centralized in any one area. However, when you're looking at close to 3 million votes for Hillary that Donald Trump didn't get, which means he didn't have the majority of the will of the people, there's a problem. There's a huge problem. Whether you're pro-Hillary or not, Mr. Trump does not represent the vast majority of Americans who voted.
No, he doesn't. And the Electoral College is in many ways, I think, an antiquated system that has outlived its time. And I'd like to see it replaced myself. You also, of course, had a problem in some of these swing states with the vote count. People were denied the right to vote, turned away from the polls. A lot of votes were lost in Michigan, in a couple of key places. In Detroit and in Flint, where they've suffered a terrible water crisis. I doubt if a lot of those people were Trump supporters. But, he supposedly won Michigan. I don't know. If we'll ever know. People like Greg Palast are out there. He's a journalist. He's, doing everything he can to expose what happened. I know that we've had 2 elections stolen, and I will use that word before, both of them by George W. Bush. The first one by the Supreme Court, taking Al Gore won the popular vote, as people may remember, and I think won that election. And then I'll tell a quick story that has been made public to some degree by Mark Crispin Miller. But some years back, I ran into John Kerry, who ran for president against Bush in 2004. I ran into him at a fundraiser. I'd met him before briefly, but I found him alone, and I went up to him and I said, did you happen to see a piece in Rolling Stone that I wrote with Bobby Kennedy Jr. that basically says they rigged the voting machines and stole the election from you? And he did a double take, as if he certainly did not expect this question at a fundraiser. But he suddenly said, "Well, yeah, I did read that article, and I know they stole the election. But by the time that my attorneys could come up with the truth about that, it was too late." And I thought I walked away from that. I wrote this down in my notebook, and I thought to myself, wow. So he could just let this happen, and for the sake of not disrupting, quote unquote, our democracy, he would just sweep it under the rug and yet admit it, years later. So I find that very, very troubling, to say the least. And, I think that we had 8 years of Bush that really led us to certainly to the economic crash of '08, and of course did result in people repudiating that world and electing Obama twice. But I think it's part of
the darn music. Dick Russell's been our guest, folks. The documentary's called A Coup in Camelot. I want to thank him so much for coming on the show. I really do appreciate this. Don't be a stranger. Don't make it another, oh my God, 8 years. How does that happen?
How does it happen? We're getting older, friend.
Great.
Look at mine. All right, very good to talk with you. Thank you.
Merry Christmas to you, my friend. I'm Brent Holland from Night Fright. Thank you all for joining us. See you all next time.
You're listening to Night Fright and your host, Brent Holland. The time is now. Your voice on the web for paranormal and conspiracy.
The JFK Assassination, the definitive book by Brent Holland. From inside the Oval Office to Dealey Plaza, first-person witness accounts. Order yours right now. NightFrightShow.com.